So good afternoon, everyone. Let me warmly welcome Alan McCully, who's going to follow up on his speech from the morning. For those who missed it, we will try, if Mr. McCully wouldn't be against, to put it online. And he'll be holding a workshop for an hour and a half, so enjoy it and prefer it.
Thank you. Well, welcome. I hope this can be a discursive occasion. I have some input, but I don't want that to dominate. And I hope that you can stop me, or I can stop me. Between us, we find breaks and we find places to discuss aspects. I also have some potentially practical activity here as well to sort of illustrate what I'm trying to do. I didn't want to bring huge suitcases of material, but I brought a couple of little illustrations that might help to enlighten what I'm trying to say. The input that I've got really is in three parts. Let me say something about my own background. I was a high school teacher for 20 years, and during that time I taught both history and what in the school I was in was called social studies. It was a fairly radical project that I got involved in my first year teaching with an Australian academic called Malcolm Skilbeck, who was a Reconstructionist. And Skilbeck set up this project in the early years of the Northern Ireland conflict. He did a situational analysis of Northern Ireland, and he came to the conclusion that our culture was thin, aggressive and translucent. Made him friends. And he set up this project that was actually in its early days very, very radical, community-based, linking schools to communities. Now, like most academics, Skilbeck quickly got another job, went away, left his project and his money, and a group of teachers from 12 schools not knowing quite what to do with it. So, like teachers, we immediately thought we need materials. And we started to produce materials which covered, it was a very familiar sort of pattern. This wasn't history, this was social studies. This was, if you like, this was an early form of citizenship education. But we looked at, in year one, it's a 5-year program. In year one, we looked at myself, personal constructions, and how people, and individuality, and similarity and difference, and so on. The second year, we looked at the role of family, different communities, different situations. The third year, we looked at community, which began to get us into local communities and the differences between local communities. In fourth year, we moved up a rung and we started to look at a unit we called territory and terrorism. We did case studies of different situations. With South Africa featured, this was in the apartheid era. We looked at the plight of travelling people. We looked at the demise of the North American native. We looked at the Middle Eastern situation, Al-Fatah and Black September, and so on. But the whole idea was, if you like, it was about home thoughts from abroad. It was looking at these issues, but bringing it back into our own situation. And then in the final year, we went back to the Northern Ireland conflict, and we asked kids, equipped with the conceptual understanding that they had developed over 5 years, their understanding of prejudice, discrimination, the use of violence, the consequences of violence, all of that. Then we went back to looking at the Northern Ireland situation and tried to apply that learning. But actually, as time went on, most of the teachers became so committed to this type of work that they realized that a 5-year continuum was unnecessary. You know, once they had built up their skills with handling controversy, they wanted to get into the issues a lot earlier than that. But it was a project, like so many projects, it didn't really outlive the length of the project that much. It didn't get embedded within the wider structures of curriculum. And while its learning, I would argue, is still very much in the system, there was a lot of disappointment at the time amongst the group who had developed these ideas that somehow we had failed in that we didn't get the stuff embedded. So there was that side of my teaching, the social studies side, and there was the history side. And in many ways I kept them apart, but was very aware of the complementarity between them. But I come from a history background which is strongly disciplinary based, and over the years, you know, that's one of the things I would be very reluctant to compromise on. And therefore I would argue that history education can go so far in dealing with controversy, but there is an appropriate time when it can then hand over that learning to contemporary affairs, if you like, social studies or citizenship education. And that may be the same teacher, or it may be in a department or in a school generally. But I think it's hugely important that young people themselves are aware of those differences, that they know when they're studying history, they know the contribution that history can make, but then they can move almost seamlessly but deliberately into the area of social studies and citizenship, where the issues are about contemporary debate, unshackled by the disciplinary constraints of history itself. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from, and I have colleagues who would argue, practitioners who would argue against me on that sort of separation. Okay, so 3 bits of input. The first, I want to put this in the teacher working in this field in the wider context. A few years ago, Alison Kitson from the Institute of Education in London, Alison had done some work in Northern Ireland, and we came up with a categorization of the teachers that we encountered. Now, I'm excluding here the teacher as ideologue, you know, the teacher who will shamelessly push their own political views on the young people. And you know, we don't have too many of those sorts of teachers, I think, in Northern Ireland, despite the nature of the society we come from. So excluding those, we come up with 3 groups of teachers. We have the avoiders, the containers, and the risk takers. The avoiders, those who do their job but are uncomfortable dealing with the difficult past. You know, it's not my job. I will keep my head down. I fear the community. I fear the backlash. But I think what they're really saying is, I don't, within myself, feel confident enough, capable enough to deal with these issues. I haven't dealt with them myself, so damn sure I'm not going to deal with them in the classroom. That's a strong premise, I think, of the message I want to get over today. Then we have the containers. Those who are really competent, effective teachers, perhaps completely committed to an inquiry, investigative approach, but they want to keep this stuff contained within the past. Very simple example from Irish history. You know, I'm prepared to look at the motivations of the rebels of 1916. I'm prepared to look at why the British executed them and there was such a backlash. But don't ask me to connect that to 1980 or 1990 or 2014 to look at the current Republican movement and where it gets its roots from and where it gets its ideology and its motivations from. Keep it in the past. Effective teachers have taken on modern methods. Their teaching is interactive, but it stops very much on that past. And then you have the risk takers. They're the group that we're really interested in today. Those that see beyond the examination system, see beyond the aims of the history curriculum, and do see themselves as wanting to demonstrate the social utility of history. They want to make connections between the past and the present. So very quickly, it's that group there that I think are the key to this. You know, you can talk about curriculum, you can talk about school ethos, all these things outside this, but ultimately the vehicle, or the unit of change rather, is the teacher and the young people they teach. It's that interaction. You know, if we want to make this sort of teaching effective, then we've got to address that relationship. And what I'm suggesting here is that there are contextual factors around that can support that teacher in that circumstance. I mean, I've seen risk takers work in pretty unfavourable conditions and do absolutely fantastic work. But they're going to be even more effective if we can create around them the conditions that will help them work effectively. I think we've got this. We've got Bush and Saltarelli's idea of two faces of education. I mean, basically, education can fuel conflict, or it can make some contribution to alleviating conflict. And most conflicts can look back and can see within the education system both structural and content that contributed to division. But if education can contribute to conflict, then I think it can also make some impact on addressing conflict and helping young people to move forward. That transformative element that I think is aspirational, but very worthwhile and worth it. Right. So obviously power comes into this. If there is a dominant group, then that dominant group may well use the education system for their own benefit. I think in our own situation, that was less critical in the sense that for much of the conflict, Northern Ireland was governed directly from London. Our own local government collapsed in 1972, and really, apart from one or two little stretches, that local parliament wasn't restored until after the peace agreement of 1998. So during that time, we were under direct rule, and while clearly the British state contributed in its own way to the conflict, in educational terms, I think there was generally goodwill that the education should make some sort of contribution. A very simple point. When the national curriculum was introduced in England in 1990, there was huge furore around the history wars about the role of history. And Kenneth Clarke, who was then the Minister of Education, actually decreed that history should stop in 1970 in schools, because he himself and many of his colleagues were very apprehensive about the potential for left-wing teachers to teach about the very recent past and to denigrate the government. In Northern Ireland, that same government were advocating that history should go up to the 1990s because their motivations were different. They saw it as hugely important that the history curriculum should address the recent past. I think the most important thing for us was that when a curriculum was introduced in 1991, that local political interference was minimal. We were still in a conflict, and yet a history curriculum was introduced which not only argued for an investigative approach, but actually specifically identified controversial periods of Irish history that should be addressed. And whereas this huge furore was going on in England over the curriculum, Northern Ireland, in the middle of a war, there was relatively little problem. And I think that's, frankly, because our local politicians aren't really interested in education and don't actually believe that education has any real power in comparison to the own influence that they have in their own communities. So I think it doesn't matter. Hopefully we as educationists can beg to differ. So, what did we introduce? Well, we introduced a constructivist curriculum. We were talking about that this morning. Now, if you don't believe in a constructivist approach, then I don't think there's much point in being in this room for the next half an hour, because you'll disagree with everything I'll say. Okay, and you know, a lot of people pay lip service to this type of curriculum, but actually, you know, there are a lot of teachers I think are much more comfortable with the transmission of knowledge, certainties, rather than the murky ground, the swamplands of constructivism. So it was inquiry-based history. It had behind it an unashamedly reconciliatory dimension. Education for mutual understanding was built into it. So the idea that history was more than simply teaching about the past, that it had a role. That curriculum was probably content heavy, but unquestionably it did at least establish within the system a sense of history as a discursive subject, historical knowledge as provisional. It wasn't always perfectly grasped by the teachers who used it, but I think there was that sense of understanding of what we were trying to achieve as teachers. And in terms of the work I've done with young people in a research capacity, it's quite clear that in Northern Ireland, young people value the history that they learn in school. They will talk about, it teaches you from both sides. It challenges your views. It allows you to think for yourself. And these are all comments that we have got from many young people talking about the value of history. Now that doesn't mean to say that it transforms them. I mean, as I was saying this morning, community forces are very strong. Young people, when they start out a unionist, they'll probably remain a unionist. They start out a nationalist, they may well remain a nationalist. But there is evidence that alongside all the other history they're encountering around them, they are trying to make sense of it through a critical lens. And I think that's a huge step forward. In 2007, we introduced a new curriculum. Stunning curriculum in many ways. Very radical. It takes as one of its three main objectives to help young people to become contributors to society. It takes that social utility of history further. It, for instance, asks young people, it asks teachers to explore with young people the relationship between their own sense of identity and the history that they learn. It asks young people to examine figures from the past who have behaved ethically and unethically. It asks them to examine how history can be both used and abused, particularly by politicians. It also, incidentally, swept away virtually all the content. Probably far too radical in that sense. When you sweep away all the prescribed content, teachers simply teach the stuff they've always taught that was prescriptive. And maybe there needed to be more guidelines on that. There was an attempt also to hand back to teachers control of what they were doing to a great extent, but in a tight framework of learning outcomes. Okay, so that's where we stand. In reality, that curriculum was not supported by in-service money and has been very imperfectly applied. Really radical curriculum, but we all know the difference between curriculum as intended and curriculum as implemented, and the gap at the moment is quite wide. For a number of reasons. Teachers everywhere are under a huge amount of pressure. We have a high stakes examination system, high levels of accountability, neoliberal influences are strong. Schools are internally pitting teacher against teacher in terms of exam results. Then the government are pitting, or the Department of Education are pitting school against school in terms of exam results. And then we all know at international level, PISA and other systems are pitching countries against countries in terms of achievement. And so, for many teachers, whether they set out this way or not, the examination system begins to dominate, and the type of history that we're encouraging tends to get pushed backwards to some extent. And I said this morning, I think there's a real problem about inquiry-based history teaching and finding a form of assessment that legitimately examines it. And a form of assessment, more particularly a form of assessment that is politically acceptable. Because governments want figures, they want results, they want targets, and so on and so forth. So I'm not in any way underestimating those very mundane pressures, if you like, acting on teachers and making it difficult for them to be risk takers. Obviously, teacher beliefs are important to this. All teachers in all society are products of their environment. When you come from a deeply divided society and a deeply divided education system, which is 95% segregated, then inevitably that background will influence your teaching. And whereas the containers very often see themselves as neutral, you know, I am the arbiter of evidence, source A, source B, source C. The risk takers are much more aware that they themselves are a product of a divided society, and they themselves will carry their prejudices and convictions into the classroom. So they must find a way of acknowledging that and also making young people aware that they too are bringing those ideas and prejudices to school. I talked about...
Maybe just ask a question.
Oh, yeah.
in your opinion, do you think that the way the examination system looks like corresponds to the majority of mindsets of teachers right now?
Our exam system did change in the mid-1980s towards a more inquiry type of approach, but it's a very imperfect relationship. I think the problem is that the teachers come to the position where they assume that the transmission of knowledge is the best way of preparing young people for exams. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I know really imaginative teachers who get fantastic exam results teaching in a more interactive way. But I think the pressures are so great in the system that many teachers, if you like, retreat towards a form of teaching that seems to get results. And once you start getting decent results, then it's hugely difficult to be a risk taker. Right? So I think we need to do more work. And certainly I would, when I'm working with teachers, I would challenge them on that and say, why can't you teach in a more open way around this? Because we know that discussion is hugely valuable to young people in developing their criticality, expressing their own opinions and hearing the opinions of others and having to mediate that and argue. So partly it's often the I haven't time, but I would interpret that as I'm not prepared to take the risk. Okay?
And isn't it easier to change the examination system?
Well, I think that's where the political dimension comes in, because we have a tradition, I'm not sure about you, but we have a tradition of external examinations administered by the Department of Education. And that's a traditional 1.5 hours, pupils are sat down, and the sort of history that we're talking about, looking at interpretations, working with evidence, that is a non-easy fit in those sorts of time constraints. So yeah, you can change the assessment system, but in changing the assessment system, you're probably asking assessment to look very different. And you would make a lot of politicians and many parents very uneasy. So I suppose we've wrestled and tried to compromise with that, but it's not always successful.
Does it mean that if you have inquiry-based teaching of history, and then you have these exams so they don't comply, you got the skills that you learn in inquiry-based process you can't use for your exams?
If I'm a teacher and I perceive that to be true, whether it's true or not, I will resort back to didactic teaching. And that is the problem, exactly. Even when you try to design assessment that addresses skills, in the context of a 1 or 2 or 3 hour exam, that can be quite superficial. Now, we have had coursework, for instance, where students work for a period of 6 weeks on an investigation and then produce a report, and then that report is submitted. And the problem there, frankly, the pressures that schools are under and the pressures that teachers are under, teacher interference in those projects. Teachers, if I am held accountable for my exam results and I have the opportunity to help a few students get higher grades, I may well fall to that temptation. And that frankly is what happened. And therefore, teachers themselves almost feel more comfortable resorting back to the external where they're not put under that pressure, or their integrity isn't questioned. So it's about priorities. It can be about burnout. What I think is absolutely critical to this is collegiality. By that I mean more than simply supporting each other. When I go back to that original project back in the 1970s, and those group of teachers that were thrust together into a room from very different backgrounds, some of those teachers found that difficult. For many of us, it was utterly transformative. For the first time, we were talking to people across community. In trying to put together materials, we were inevitably stumbling on controversies. Very simple example. We were doing what we thought was a very non-controversial exercise. Everyone was asked to bring in a photograph of something that illustrated difference. So somebody brought a photograph of a black beauty queen. Somebody brought a photograph of a travelling person. Someone brought a photograph of a skinhead. And someone brought a photograph of a female policewoman in a Royal Ulster Constabulary uniform. Now to us from the Protestant community, that was a photograph of a smiling policewoman. But to some of those from the other community, that was a blatant attempt to introduce propaganda into the project. And that photograph nearly blew that project apart. But it was the working through of that, and one or two people maybe departed at that stage, but it was the working through that as young professionals that was the transformative dimension of that. And once we got through that, then we quickly accelerated into other things. But it is that recognition of difference of perception and the need to talk through that, to critique it, but also to respect it. That was very, very important. And that to me is a critical dimension of teaching controversial issues. There's no point in asking a teacher to go in to deal with difficult issues in the classroom when they haven't worked through those issues for themselves and they're feeling uncomfortable. If you get a chance to look at some of the work done in South Africa around this, and the name, I'll come back to the name in a minute. Some of the work has been done there because you're not just dealing with people with very different perspectives, you're dealing with people coming from very different power bases. But the sort of encounter work that was done there with history teachers, I think has been hugely powerful in moving those teachers forward and allowing them to teach in a post-apartheid South Africa. The other thing I would argue strongly, the risk taker can work in isolation, but it is really important that they have the ethos and the leadership of the school behind them. When your work is validated, I think it is much, you sleep easier in your bed. But that involves also transparency on your part as a teacher. That you're open with management what you're doing, and you get their acceptance of what you're doing. And some of the stuff I did as a high school teacher, the principal of the school found uncomfortable. But he never once didn't back me. I was the guy who did those things. Bit of a head case, but I did them. And he accepted them and supported me. And supported me to the rest of the staff. So I think that's really, you can work in isolation, but it leaves you very vulnerable. Working through that as a staff community, as a school community. And while there will be those who don't want to have anything to do with it, simply having their recognition that the work is valid hugely important. I talked earlier about avoiders, and avoidance is not necessarily a negative thing. Many of the teachers that I have worked with will say things, and very genuinely say things, I didn't want to offend. I didn't want to anger the other. You know, so for the best of reasons, they may try to avoid controversy. Or I didn't want, and one thing that comes through quite strongly, in the area that I teach in, let's say it's a hardline Protestant working class area, I just couldn't deal with those issues because it would only stir up the children into mayhem. And yet, of course, it's exactly in those communities that paramilitarism is using its influence on the young people of the area. You know, so no school needs that more. It is my experience working in a fairly hardline area that in many ways a lot of this apprehension is imagined. If you go about it the right way, there are many parents who actually welcome their children getting another point of view. I've had comments, I wish we had done things like that at school. You know, so I can't be blanket on this, but I think that people need to grow, test the waters, see what's possible. And sometimes you might find you're getting support from quite unexpected quarters. Providing people see that you are not pushing one point of view. You know, that I'm not here to turn your child into this or that or that. I am here to try to get them to think critically and to ask questions about what they're doing. So it's nice on Parents' Evening when parents come in and say, "You were teaching about that the other day. Tell me more about it." There's some. So I'm not underestimating those sorts of community pressures, but I do feel in our context anyway, they're sometimes exaggerated because it's convenient to do so. Okay, so anybody else want to question?
Just comment that at some moment you said, like, I believe, and no matter whether I just, whether it's true or not. So this is a little bit like this. I mean, if you believe there is a fear of something, it's kind of like that distinction between when it's real and imagined is kind of very difficult to grasp.
Yeah. But I think with a lot of work around controversy, teaching controversy, teachers need opportunities to dip their toes in the water. I've worked quite a lot with youth workers, and youth workers find this a lot easier. Yeah, they have the social skills, group work skills, but actually in youth work, I might be working with you and you're a novice, but I might say, just take over. You're in with the room with me, you're working with me. Unfortunately, teachers tend to work in solitary confinement, and they can go to a training course and they can see someone like me working with them, and they can say, well, that's interesting, that's quite good, but it's a huge leap to go back into the isolation of your classroom. And actually, whereas I think youth workers working together, working as teams, find that a lot easier. Again, giving people the opportunities to move forward, to try things, but as a gradient. I mean, I don't send my students out to teach about paramilitarism on their first day of teaching practice. I would completely say, no, look, get into that school. It may be that in your 3-month practice, you'll never really get an opportunity. But be sussing out, look for chances. Think of this as a 1 or 2 year or 3 year project down the line. I want to be a risk taker. I want to be engaged in this category. Okay. See what you think of these. I suppose they're an amalgam of my teaching and my research. What role should there be for history and teaching controversial issues? First is myth busting and exposing the abuse of history. Challenging entrenched and unsubstantiated positions, or aspects of popular myth that become accepted within society. Very simple example from our own context. You see it in school textbooks, never mind in community banners in the streets. The signing of the Ulster Covenant in 1912 in opposition to Home Rule. I've seen textbooks, and some even signed in their own blood. Well, they've done scientific experiments on copies, and there was only one that appeared to be in blood. It was by a leading unionist, and when they examined it further, it was actually symbolically red. It wasn't his own blood at all. You know, it's those, in themselves, maybe not that important, but when kids begin to realize that even something in a textbook can't be substantiated, you know, that opens that little doubt, and it begins to make them think, yeah, history is provisional knowledge. Historical knowledge develops and changes with further evidence. Recognizing complexity. I think too often we have fallen into underestimating young people's capacity for complexity, for understanding difficult and multiple forms of the past. So we should be, as one young man said to me, this history's great, but it makes your head hurt. We should be prepared to challenge kids and make them think. We should be encouraging them to examine other interpretations of the past. I mean, and I'm not here talking about academic interpretation. No, I'm talking about film. I'm talking about the ways in which the representations of the past reach them. All of those things, the murals in the community, banners in the community, all these things should be interrogated because they are interpretations of the past. And we should be encouraging kids then to come up with their own informed interpretations, but then be prepared to share those and to have them challenged by others. Enable students to engage in metacognition. What I was talking about earlier. Students can be aware of how their own backgrounds and allegiances might come to influence the way they interpret the past. 5 or 6 years ago, I took one of my student teachers to Kilmainham Jail in Dublin. She was from a Protestant background, and we were standing in the courtyard where the British executed 12 of the leaders of the Rising. The Irish flag is there, and the plaque is there. Highly emotive. And then we went to the pub, and we discussed our experience. And she for the first time, she said, her quote was something like this. She was a 2-1 history graduate from Queen's University in Belfast. I now realise that I have been interpreting the past through the lens of the Troubles. You know, for the first time, she had come down off her academic pedestal. She had engaged with the sort of emotional aspects of that site visit, and for the first time she could see that her own background her own upbringing had influenced how she saw the past. And I think we can do that with young people as well. We can help them to see that their own backgrounds may influence the way they see the past. And we can't change that, but what we can do is make them aware so that they will better be able to critique what's put in front of them. And as I say, I think that's just as true of us as teachers as it is of the young people we teach. Involve students in a constant dialogue between the events of the past and the present. That takes the container to the risk taker. You know, that's what engages young people, when they can see the relevance. You know, too often in my own teaching, you talk for 35 minutes about an event, and then in the last 5 minutes or 2 minutes, you know, you've made some vague references to how it's commemorated today. Well, why not put that on its head? Why not start with how it's commemorated and then investigate the legitimacy of that commemoration? Explore young people's sense of identity and how that is influenced by their own understanding of history. Help students understand the recent violent past, if such exists, including critically examining personal experiences of those events. We have been pretty slow in the Northern Ireland context at introducing young people to the more recent past. We do have an elective and examination level which deals with the Troubles, but it does tend to get subsumed by examination priorities. It's good that it's there, but there isn't really the space to open it up for dialogue. Now further down the school, in the junior school, we have a clause which asks young people to examine the short-term and longer-term consequences of partition. So we're not explicitly asking teachers to deal with the more recent past, but through that we're encouraging them to look at Ireland post-partition and to the way in which the more recent conflict evolved. But when it all said and done, you know, I think the key role of history is providing an informed context, a critical context for contemporary dialogue. You know, this is what I mean about history making one contribution, but that other areas of the curriculum have also much to offer. And our revised curriculum puts a lot of stress on this idea of an interconnected curriculum, where the English teacher, the religious education teacher, the history teacher, the citizenship teacher actually work together and are aware, not work in the same classroom, but in a curriculum sense, know what each other's doing and knows what their individual contributions are. Okay, anyone want to chat?
Organized 3 groups. The first one was avoiders. I wonder whether in conditions in Northern Ireland whether you can be a avoider teaching history. Because I feel like you have to touch history that it's somehow relevant to both communities very often.
Yeah, but I think I question that word relevance when I'm dealing only about the past. I think what makes history relevant is its contemporary profile and its use. So I think I could go in and teach. I have seen, say, the Easter Rising taught in a contained way. Even they may be dealing with what is potentially controversial, but as teachers themselves, if they don't address the controversy, it largely remains uncontroversial. It's just something you did in school, and the connections aren't necessarily made with what they encounter outside. Or they simply take what they encounter outside as the real world, and the history learned in school is just something you do.
And how much segregated schools are in Northern Ireland? Because I think if you have integrated both members of both communities, it can raise some questions. You know, we speak about the first wars.
Yeah.
So how much segregated?
95%. It's heavily segregated. There's a small integrated sector which has about 7%. Those schools emerged in the 1980s. There's now 62 of them, but only 20 of them are secondary schools. Yeah, it's an interesting one. Teaching in a highly segregated school. It was my role as a teacher to present alternative viewpoints. It was my role to be agent provocateur. And I could get away with that easier because they knew I was one of them, really. So that gave me license. And so it can work. But of course, there's going to be a restricted access to the other. In integrated schools in the early days, actually teachers found it very, very difficult because they did not want to offend. They did not want to break that commonality, common school experience by raising difference. As time went on, those differences tended to raise their ugly head, and integrated schools realized that they had to deal with difference as well as what kids had in common. So while I know what you're saying, I still think that in segregated environment, you can, as a risk taker, raise difficult issues. In an integrated environment, once you get it right, then quite clearly you've the potential there to really get the discourse going.
Because I've heard, but I don't know if it's true, that there are some attempts to integrate kids from G schools in some subjects. I've heard it's not history, it's like chemistry they do together.
Yeah, I mean, we're going down, so I'll digress very quickly. Integrated school, integrated education is written into the Good Friday Agreement. That should be encouraged. But it has, over the last few years, I won't say stalled, but it's hugely slowed down. Simply because, for economic reasons, that you already had maybe 4 schools in a town, and suddenly you were creating a 5th at a time of demographic downturn. So you were creating more school places, and you were perhaps damaging other teachers in other schools who were put out of jobs. In the last 10 years, Queen's University particularly have promoted what they call shared education. So it is segregated schools, building more systematic links. It's always been informal links, one-to-one teacher links between schools in many areas. But this is an attempt to build a much more systemic connection between schools. So at a low level, they might be sharing sports facilities, but at the top level, they are actually sharing classes, moving between each other's schools, and even sharing joint history. I was involved in a couple of board history groups coming together in an event last week, looking at the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland in 1968. So yeah, that is happening. It's a big debate. Is shared education about the glass half full or the glass half empty? Is it just an attempt to bring about connections, but really preserving the status quo? Kids are still in their own schools, they're still wearing their own uniforms, or is it a conduit that can ultimately lead to transformation, and maybe even schools coming together as single institutions. The jury's out. Our institution tends to be very critical. The other university in Northern Ireland is heavily promoting it.
I would like to ask you about the role of Irish language in all these discussions and education.
Wow.
Is there any or?
Well, yeah. Also, as part of the Good Friday Agreement, was recognition of the Irish language. The problem with the Irish language is that it is set completely in one community. Sadly, because historically, many Presbyterians and other Protestants helped promote and keep the Irish language alive. But unfortunately, during the conflict, the Irish language became associated with republicanism, and it's a sort of, I won't say weapon, some might say it's a weapon, but as a tool in which to produce cultural separateness. In the last few years, the Irish language has demanded equal recognition, and that has been strongly resisted by the unionist population, and particularly by the party in government, the DUP. And one of the main reasons for our government collapsing 2 years ago was around their refusal to recognise an Irish Language Act. Irish language schools, probably about 2% of the population. There are other schools that have an Irish language department or an Irish language component within them. I suppose the big debate is how far is the Irish language being used as a political tool, and how far has it got legitimate cultural rights? And the answer is it absolutely has the right, but there is some sense that it is a political weapon to use against the other.
So because I'm asking because of the history, and you are doing the history of which is written somewhat probably in Irish language, and then the second you are talking about the new North Island identity, that it is can't be connected with Irish language. It's still English, is it?
The only Irish medium schools teach in Irish.
Yeah.
And they have the facility to do all their exams in Irish, and there are textbooks in Irish. The real issue is the wider use of the language in the community, the use of bilingual signs. You go to nationalist areas, there will be bilingual signs, but not in unionist areas. And the unionist community would fear that those types of things would become statutory if there was an Irish Language Act.
My question is regarding the profile of average teacher in Northern Ireland in terms of excellence or competence, because I think this kind of teaching, like inquiry-based teaching, requires like being self-assured and being like actually to have a very good base of knowledge, while I think many Czech teachers lack this good knowledge of history. I think they excellent teachers are only a minority, and many of them are just average, so this kind of uncertainty about how to teach can be related also that they don't have that broad knowledge of history itself, and how then this approach can be applied also to teachers who are not, I think in Czech Republic, not excellent students really go to study pedagogy and become teachers, because the profession is not well paid, it's not conditioned by history.
Well, first of all, I don't see any conflict between a teacher who is really proficient in subject knowledge and inquiry-based history teaching. You cannot teach inquiry if you do not have a really strong, sound disciplinary knowledge. And that's knowledge not just of subject knowledge, but the discipline itself. So I would argue very strongly that competency in both those areas is vital. Yeah, we're very lucky, I suppose, that my own teachers who come to teach history are some of the best young historians. They're not brilliantly paid, but they're adequately paid. And Northern Ireland is not economically doesn't have that much opportunity in other spheres. So teaching is regarded as a solid, but also a lot of them come. And I'm finding this particularly in the post-Good Friday era. You know, a lot of them come with a big commitment to do this type of work. You know, these are young people who want to bring about change. When I first did this type of work at university, I sometimes got a fair amount of criticism and even complaints, but not in the last 10, 15 years. So I'm finding young people are up for this. And they're keen.
So for young people, being teacher is a kind of good perspective.
It's a good perspective, and they want to be there. 5, 6, 7, 8 years into the teaching, they get worn down by the accountability and by the workload. But at the beginning, at least, they go for it. I can see nods of recognition.
Maybe for obvious reasons we are talking about sort of 20th century history mainly. Here in the Czech Republic there's like a chronicle sort of weakness maybe of teaching history, but I don't know to what extent it's a myth now, because it's some surveys say maybe it's going better, but basically we are supposed to teach world history and kind of from, you know, Homo sapiens evolution to, let's say, fall of the Soviet Union, kind of.
Yeah.
And of course what happens is that you get delayed and delayed and delayed. So in most schools I think still probably, I don't know whether you agree, it's still probably the model that you start a 4 years long history course in ancient history and you gradually are supposed, but basically you're late. Yeah. So there's not enough time. Is that issue in Ireland, or you not, because it's an Anglo-Saxon system, or I know you're not supposed to cover it all?
No, and that's one of the sacrifices I think this type of approach demands. That cavemen and spacemen just has to be dropped. You know, you have to be more selective in what you do. And that leads to criticism that young people don't always get a big picture of the past. But there are ways, I think, of compensating for that. I suppose in our own curriculum, you know, decisions were made in 1991 about what the priorities were and what it was essential that young people should study, and it was deemed essential that they should deal with aspects of Irish history right from Norman times, key periods, right through to the 20th century. And the idea was that those should build on each other, build on the chronology, so that by the time they, and on the skills development, so that by the time they got to 20th century history, and arguably more controversial, you know, we could argue with that they were equipped with knowledge and skills to deal with it.
Because there must be some controversial issues in the 17th century.
Yes, absolutely. The Ulster plantation, particularly. Yeah.
So
how Protestant settlers.
Are you saying that they are like growing to be more able to talk about the sort of the lively stuff when you're talking about 17th century?
I'd be very careful before I'd say that, you know. So there's a hierarchy of controversy. I could certainly teach. I think the plantation period, for example, is really important because that gives you the roots of cultural difference. And so on. But again, it's making that can be taught in a deadly boring way if you don't make those connections, if you don't help young people to see that this is relevant to their everyday lives. that the lad who marches in an orange march with a banner behind him, that banner is actually portraying something in relation to the plantation. You know, he'll perk up because suddenly something that is very important to him, which he doesn't understand, is being explained to him. Conscious of time, I think it's worth seeing some material. And this is a very simple example. I've only got about 15 of these. Yeah. So here's a very, obviously there's a lot of teaching and go on around this, around the First World War and so on. Well, I talked this morning about the way in which the peace agreement and recently the commemoration of the First World War has opened up Catholic families to aspects of their past that have been closed down for 30, 40, even 50 years. And we know, for example, after World War I, that there were young men returning from the trenches to an Ireland that was bitterly divided, that was at civil war, was at the War of Independence against the British. You know, and though they just couldn't express that they had come from the trenches, they'd been fighting for Britain, and they were going into communities that were now fighting against Britain. You know, so you can understand how those stories got suppressed within families. And then, even if those stories had been known prior to the 1960s, once you had the British Army on the streets policing those nationalist communities and engaging in confrontation, then how does a family recognise ancestors who had fought on the British side? You know, so all sorts of skeletons and cupboards around this. And many families have had the opportunity in recent years to open those boxes and to re-examine family history from that perspective. So this is just a very simple exercise in basically asking the question, you know, the classic line, they died for Ireland, you know, would be very much associated with the Easter Rising and those who gave up their lives to fight against the British. Whereas Least We Forget is a phrase usually used in the UK for those who fell in World War I and World War II. So this is just a bit of material. So asking the question, well, who were the patriots in that period? Or were there more than one patriot? So you can just read the quotes. John Redmond, constitutional nationalist, at the beginning of the First World War, the Irish volunteers had been set up prior to the war to demonstrate the will for home rule for Ireland. At the outbreak of war, Redmond committed the volunteers to the British war effort, not to fight for the UK, but to demonstrate the fitness of Ireland to be an independent nation, or at least a nation with its own government. At the same time, you've got a quote from Padraig Pearse, one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, more conventional view of what patriotism is in an Irish context. Wee Joe Devlin is a northern politician who actively campaigned to recruit for the British Army, a supporter of Redmond. And finally, you've got James Connolly taking the third view, a socialist, a revolutionary socialist, who argued for a place for the working class, a working class definition of what it is to be Irish. Give me time just to read those quotes. Can you see how that could be the starting point for an interrogation, an investigation of patriotism? I've done this exercise with a group of teacher education students in Dublin City University in the Republic, and it was just absolutely powerful, because within that group there were those who had relatives who had fought for Britain in the war. So presented them with this and sent them off to investigate and to come back with their family histories, their stories. So there were those who had fought for Britain, and there were those who had been involved in the War of Independence against the British. And in one lovely case, there was someone who had been both, who had come back from the war and joined the IRA and then fought against the British. But you know, you can imagine the sort of dialogue that got going, because that would be quite a submerged issue in the south of Ireland. It was opening up that whole question at the very time that this was just after the 1916 Rising, you know, when the whole idea of patriotism had been up for question. And people had competed for ownership of the rising political parties. Who are the true survivors? Who have the true linkages with that the past? Because nearly all political parties in the Irish Republic claim some sort of allegiance to 1916 in some way or other. So they were arguing the thing.
Maybe just on the practical level, what would you ask the students to do with this resource? Would they sort of have to, just an example?
Well, what we did there, and it wouldn't work in every case, but we sent them away to bring in personal stories. And then we documented those stories. So we had about 8 or 10 in the group who had direct experience, some who had lost relatives in the trenches, others who had survived the war, some who had been ostracized as a consequence. So I think that it worked because we were putting personal history onto wider events. But then in turn we looked at how these figures are regarded historically. So as you can imagine, Redmond has tended to get a bad press. You know, the guy who compromised, the guy who got down the constitutional route, the guy who got, well, he died before the end of the war, but basically his party got blown away in the aftermath of war. But equally, while Pearse is for some a hero, I mean, some of Pearse's writing is scary, scary stuff. You know, he talks about the need to, he talks about the battlefields of Belgium and the blood is being spilled to refresh Europe. But we as Irishmen are not part of that struggle, so we must spill our own blood to refresh the nation and to go forward. So that's where it led us into those sorts of, and then debating how each of these figures was commemorated. Connolly would tend to get a good press, more for his socialism than for his revolutionary nationalism. He was executed in the 1916 Rising along with Pearse. But because he's got a socialist background, you know, he tends to get a softer press than maybe the really fashionable, those fascist stuff of Pearse.
What extent could it work outside a diversity which you may get at the university level? So taking into account, maybe also translating it into the Czech conditions. One such cleavage, definitely not as strong, but could be of the winners and losers of the transformation after 1989. To some extent, but not at all places. Both groups are present, and as you said, to be the advocate, devil's advocate from the side of the teacher isn't the same experience as having both identities impersonated and face to face.
I think that's just one of the constraints of a a segregated situation. But I think you can find those stories in print. You can find ways of conveying those stories. And even as a teacher, you could hot seat one of those characters who fought in the war and will get that personal dimension, particularly if it's based on an actual character and you've got the evidence to support it. I'll give you the example that I used in the lecture today. I have run this exercise as a workshop in itself. It's looking at commemoration, and it's looking at the way in which the 1916 Rising was commemorated in Belfast in 1966. It was under a unionist government who had to make a big decision. How was it going to handle a rising, a commemoration of a rising which potentially could cause serious unrest, both amongst those commemorating it and those who were opposed to the commemoration. So we produced a series of documents, and we asked the kids to take the role of Brian McCully, who was the then Minister of Home Affairs in the Northern Ireland government. We present him with the kids with police evidence, police reports, potential trouble. We present them with government statements, and we ask them to put themselves in McCully's position and to make a decision. Does he ban the commemoration? Does he try to contain it? How does he react? And once they've made that decision, then we give them the decision that he took. And he took a decision which was actually quite brave for a Unionist Minister of Home Affairs. He decided to allow the commemorations, providing they were contained within nationalist areas. Despite the fact that there appeared to be a huge backlash amongst his own community coming if he did that. Now, we take them through those events on the day where the violence was contained. There was trouble. There were instances of Catholics being attacked on the fringes of the commemoration. But on the whole, it was probably a pretty good decision that he made. But it was the consequences in both those communities that really we wanted to examine. Because in the nationalist community, there was this sense of that they had been deprived, that they had been contained, that they had been, as usual, the weight of the state had come in against them. On the Unionist side, there was this sense of betrayal, and the open displays of Irish tricolours, of bunting, of Irish colours had made the Protestant community very fearful and made them fear that if they allowed this to continue, the state could be threatened. And those reactions are captured in the words of two paramilitaries who subsequently became leading aggressors in the conflict. Gusty Spence of the UVF and Martin Meehan, an IRA gunman. So, next stage of our teaching was to say, well, okay, what would you ask Gusty and Martin if you were to meet them? And one teacher can do it, two teachers can do it. I've done it simply by changing hats, a black beret for the IRA, a little military cap for the UVF. The class are given time to come up with questions and then to interrogate these two figures about why they chose the role that they did. I should say that both of them, in the later stages of their lives, became peacemakers. So they moved from paramilitary violence back to parliamentary constitutional methods. Meehan was involved in the peace process on the Republican side, and Gusty Spence actually signed the UVF's disarmament clause. Both are dead now. Anybody got a question for either of them? Yeah.
Excuse me, I have a question regarding how reliable can your answers be to this, for the students if they ask you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the judgment. How reliable is your history teaching? It's the same question, isn't it, really? You're making sure that what you have to say is based as far as possible on their own biographies. But yes, there will be artistic license.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's about transparency, isn't it? That's about making it clear to the class that you are playing these parts and that you are taking that license. No questions?
Well, I do have one. At the beginning, you suggested that those who don't believe in constructivism probably wouldn't agree with you. And you are trying to make the pupils think in school, which is a very difficult task. And how much do the other subjects contribute to the constructivist method of teaching?
Yeah, that's an important constraint. I think probably history is furthest along this line.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. I think in other subjects there's still, well, I think English, teaching of literature would be an ally. In some cases, religious education too.
How about math or physics?
Less so, perhaps. But I think that's where it is really important again, that in the collegial atmosphere of the school, there is some sort of consensus about how you progress along these lines. Yeah, if history is the only subject that is pushing perspectives and discourse and active engagement, then I think it's going to be much more difficult. Now, I find that, for example, with group work. Now, if you try to organise group work in a school where the young people have no experience, it's very difficult to get it working effectively. But when different subjects come to embrace that, then it becomes relatively easy. So let me finish in a more general set of guidelines, I think, for a risk taker. Be it a history teacher or a citizenship teacher or a social studies teacher. The importance of sharing biography. Acknowledging the possibility of your own prejudice and uncertainty. One youth worker said to me, you know, I make it plain that I don't have all the answers to this, that I'm finding this difficult, that I'm struggling with it just like you. Not many teachers are not often comfortable at acknowledging their own inadequacies. But I think it's hugely important in this type of work. Showing respect for the right of all viewpoints to be heard and ensuring that they are challenged sensitively. There will be young people with very strong, sometimes ill-considered views. You cannot simply silence them. Those views have got to be heard, but heard under certain conditions. The use of certain language is inappropriate. So you have ground rules, but within those ground rules, those views can be heard. But anyone who hears them can expect to be challenged. And certainly as a teacher, if that challenge wasn't coming from their colleagues, it would come from me. Use of experimental learning approaches. It's coming out of the I know everything role to that of facilitator. Now sometimes the I know everything role, that type of teaching is important and it's part of your repertoire. But when you're dealing with difficult issues and controversial issues, it's got to be a much more facilitatory role. And you've got to be comfortable with that role. You've got to be able to step back and allow others to talk. Surprising sometimes how reluctant teachers are. And then, of course, if you dominate and then expect young people to respond, they're unlikely to, because they know someone off. Building that type of classroom where dialogue is a norm. It's very important. Knowing the group and acting through professional judgment. There will be times when you raise issues that produce an emotional reaction in kids. Something in their background you didn't know. That's inevitable. You've got to hold your nerve and deal with that. But obviously the more you know about the young people you teach, the more you can prepare yourself for more difficult issues. And some groups will be further down the road in this type of work than others. There isn't a one size fits all. Some groups you go very slowly, some you go more quickly. Next one is controversial in itself, but sharing a sense of risk with the young people that you're working with. Sometimes you are working at variance with the school, and getting over that sense to young people, I think, can be very valuable. They see that you are taking risks on their behalf. You're one of them, and I think that can be useful with him. And in the light of all of this, when you do get reactions, when there are, you've got to be prepared. You can't let the bell go in the middle of a discussion, a heated discussion. If it does, you've just got to make sure that you hold them there and you debrief. And you've got to look at time. You've got to give adequate time for debriefing, for them to evaluate the situation, and if necessary, for emotional support. And I find that even working with teachers whose family history has victims within it. Maybe this is the first time in public company they have talked about that, and inevitably there will be high levels of emotion and there can be some distress. The distress doesn't mean to say that it isn't valuable providing support.
I'm up.